Compassion encircles the earth for all beings everywhere.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Traveling Vegan YouTube channel. I'm Philip Nicozisis, the best-selling author of Have Laptop Will Travel, and I'm here with Dr. Will and Madeline Tuttle of the World Peace Diet. And Dr. Will is going to give his signature lecture based on the main ideas in the World Peace Diet. And before we do that, first of all, welcome to the show. Madeline, welcome. And Will, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Philip.
And I would like to give you a signed copy of my book, Have Laptop Will Travel. And I would like to read you the inscription real quick before we get started. And the inscription says, "Dear Will and Madeline, thank you for inspiring us to live a CAPE life. C-A-P-E. Celebratory, adventurous, purposeful, and extraordinary. All the best. Please accept my book
Thank
for your
you
collection."
so much.
Great.
Terrific.
Thank you.
We're
and
honored.
Now we will very much watch and listen to your lecture. Thank you.
Thanks so much. All right. Everyone, I would really like to thank Philip for this fantastic vegan traveling show. I'm going to speak about some of the main ideas in the World Peace Diet. And the number one reason I wrote the World Peace Diet essentially was to create another way of looking at the situation that we have in our world today. Most of us know that we face a whole galaxy of problems, they're interconnected problems that are very daunting for us to face. There's a whole list of them. We talk about, for example, we have a terrible problem with pandemics and disease. We have problems with hunger and starvation. We have economic and social injustice. We have various types of environmental devastation, war, terrorism, so many different problems. They are interconnected, but the main idea is that there's human abuse of animals as on that list. And for most of us, it's very far down on the list. We think that we'll solve our human problems, and then when we get around to it, we'll take care of the animals and stop treating them so badly. And the reason I wrote the World Peace Diet was to take our routine mistreatment of animals for food and other products and take it from the bottom of the list and put it at the top of the list where it actually belongs. Because our abuse of animals is not only enormously egregious in the amount of sheer suffering we're causing them, but it is also the spinning fury at the core of our culture. It's the invisible violence that is radiating into our culture that is vast and mind-boggling in its scope, and it is actually generating and creating the whole galaxy of problems that we're facing. All those other problems on the list are actually outcomes, are directly caused by animal agriculture. They're consequences of animal agriculture, of what I refer to in the World Peace Diet as herderism. We live in a herding culture that's organized at its core around herding animals. We're not all walking around with a crook and we're poking sheep. Now it's industrialized. It's a massive industrialized scale animal agriculture where the animals are stuck in these stinking sheds where they never see the light of day by the thousands or maybe by the tens of thousands. Billions of animals are killed every year by us, and the good news underlying everything is that it's completely unnecessary. There are no nutrients that we need to be healthy that we have to harm animals to get. I've been a vegan now for over 40 years, and I'm not the only one. There are millions of people who are thriving on a plant-based diet. And that's the great good news, is that we can thrive on a plant-based way of eating and living. And it's so much better for the earth, for ecosystems, for indigenous people, for our health, for animals, for wildlife, on every level. We can be a force of healing and awakening in our world rather than a force for harm and terror and fear and pain and despair, which is really what happens when we're eating animal-based foods. So the essential message that I'd like to share with you in the World Peace Diet is a positive message of social transformation, of radiant health, of really getting to the root of the dilemmas that we're facing. If we don't address animal agriculture, we're still just hacking away at the branches. And as Thoreau said, there's 1,000 people hacking at the branches for every one who's going to the root. You can be someone who goes to the root. And when we move to a plant-based way of eating and understand the reasons why, then we're going to the roots of the problems that we're having. And we'll find our own physical health not only improving, but also our mental health, our spiritual health, our cultural health, our environmental health. They're all interconnected. And animal agriculture erodes and destroys all 5 dimensions of health. That's the crucial thing to understand on both the outer level and the inner level. Because animal agriculture is so wasteful of resources, we're growing huge amounts of grain to feed the animals and then eating the flesh of these animals. So these animals are converting massive amounts of land. According to the National Academy of Sciences, it's 15 to 1. It takes 15 times as much land to feed people eating the standard Western diet as people eating a plant-based diet. So we're creating enormous quantities of sewage and pollution, using enormous quantities of petroleum and water and all of that, while people are going hungry and starving if they could eat this grain. So the wars that we're having, the conflicts that we're having, very often are driven by injustice, by hungry people who don't have enough to eat, while we take more than we need. As Gandhi said, that this earth is abundant. Have you noticed that our earth is beautiful? I'm sure you have along the way. Our earth is beautiful, it's abundant. This awareness that our earth is abundant, that we can feed everyone actually on a fraction of the land, and that we don't need to have starvation. We don't need to have chronic hunger and disease, that we can create and co-create a world of peace and freedom and sustainability and justice by understanding what is not taught to us, by understanding what is hidden from us. In many ways, we're deceived in our society by the institutions that profit from animal agriculture. And so I'd like to just encourage all of us to question the underlying narrative in our society that we need to imprison animals and kill them and steal their purposes, steal their milk, steal their eggs, steal their lives, steal their children. When we steal all these things from these animals, we're not only causing tremendous suffering and pain and fear and despair and misery in their lives, we're also eating that misery and that despair and pain. And we're feeding that to our innocent children, who then teach their kids to do the same thing. This is something that rolls through the generations. The violence that we're inflicting on animals every day by the millions, actually by the billions when we include marine animals, that violence boomerangs back into our society in many ways. Some of them are visible. We see that we're getting sick directly. When we see the hospitals being filled with people with cancer and heart disease and diabetes, osteoporosis, liver disease, kidney disease, dementia, all these diseases are well understood to be a direct result of eating animal foods. We see that rainforests are being cut down at 4 or 5 acres per second in many cases to grow soybeans, genetically engineered to feed to these poor animals who are abused. That this wastefulness is causing the largest mass extinction of species in 65 million years, for example. So the destruction of the earth, of our health, the creation of war and conflict and disease and pandemics, all of this is driven by the invisible cause of animal agriculture. The violence that we inflict on others boomerangs back into our own lives, into ourselves, into our communities, into our relationships, even into our psyches. We find that these poor animals, for example, very often are banging their heads against the bars, just driven into a form of insanity by the frustration of being immobilized and can't move. And we find, of course, pharmaceutical industries making huge profits on pharmaceutical medications for people with depression and anxiety and all the same problems mentally that these animals are experiencing. So again, what we sow, we reap. And if we sow kindness and caring and love, this is really coming home to our true nature, coming home to a sense of caring for others. So the main thing to understand is that every culture transmits its values from generation to generation. All cultures do that, and they do it through the rituals of that culture. And every culture has meals, and anthropologists understand that the meals are the main way that societies transmit their values. And so when we look deeply into our meals, this is the greatest adventure of awakening, because we're looking deeply into the programming of our society. We're not just eating food when we're sitting down as a little kid at the table. We're eating a whole constellation of attitudes and practices and behaviors that we eat and embody, and then we teach to others. And they're not in our best interest. Some of the attitudes we're eating, for example, the attitude of disconnectedness, of just not thinking about where things come from, not making the connections. And the ability to make connections actually is intelligence. So we're reducing our intelligence individually and as a society. We're eating the attitude of predation, the attitude of domination and exploitation, the attitude of reductionism, of reducing other beings to commodities, not seeing a being as a being, but just seeing a being as something to be bought and sold. And so we create whole economic and political systems based on humans using each other as instruments. This is all based on animal agriculture. So to understand that if we want to eat animal foods, we're going to create a world where not only are animals exploited and abused and oppressed, and in many ways enslaved, that the same thing happens to us. We become exploited and abused, and in many cases enslaved by each other and by the systems that we've created. So again, the good news is that we can co-create together a world of kindness and caring and freedom and liberation that is awake and appreciative and in harmony with nature. The price we have to pay is the meat and the eggnog and the milkshake and the non-organic foods. Well, the organic is critical because as soon as we use herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, and chemical fertilizers, we're destroying ecosystems, we're harming our own health, we find cancer increasing, and really we see that the hospitals are filled with people who are there because of eating diets high in animal-based foods and high in foods that have a lot of chemicals in them. So to become aware and conscious, move to a plant-based organic way of eating and living, share these ideas with other people, and be a force for understanding. Because as soon as we're eating these animal-based foods, we find dementia and heart disease and liver disease and kidney disease and autoimmune diseases and all these diseases that are proliferating in our society are directly caused by animal-based meals and by the underlying attitudes of dominating and exploiting animals. And in the World Peace Diet, I go into these ideas in a lot more depth. I talk about for example, the history of this and how this developed about 10,000 years ago in what is today Iraq, and how it led eventually to what we see today, a capitalist society based on war and a wealthy elite class and the domination of women, and in many ways the domination of nature. So in order to heal this at a deep level, we're called to get to the roots of the causes. In my own life, just to give a short illustration, I remember growing up in New England back in the 1950s, and I remember asking my mother, we were eating the typical meals back then, if everybody eats like we do. And my mother said, yeah, we pretty much eat the same way everybody else is eating. And then she came back a few minutes later after answering my question and said, I'm sorry, that's not completely true. There are vegetarians. And I had never heard that word in my life, and I was really interested. So I said, Mom, what the heck is a vegetarian? And my mother thought about it for a second, and then she said, it's too complicated. You're never going to meet one. And she was right. She said, and she also said, I don't know where they get their protein. So my mother was right. I never heard the word again. I had this idea from what she said that these vegetarians are extremely rare, and if you do find one, they're probably dragging themselves through the dirt, and they're probably very weak and hungry and miserable because they're not getting enough protein. So I went away to a summer camp in Vermont. I learned to kill my own chickens. We even learned to kill our own dairy cows. This is something that goes on all animal agriculture operations. Obviously, you're killing these animals at a very young age. So for me as a young kid, 13, 14 years old, I learned to do that. I was completely programmed that this was the right thing to do. I was told, make sure you get enough protein. God gave us these animals to eat. They don't have a soul. They taste good. All these basic rationalizations. Now I can see how this was absolutely incorrect. But this is what I had been told. Fortunately for me, I left home when I was right after college in my early 20s, and I ended up discovering a community. This was back in 1975. It was a big old hippie commune actually back in the day. And they were all vegetarians. They were actually vegans. And there's about 900 people, and they were thriving. And they had about 200 children that were vegan from birth. They were doing great. So there it was. I could see clearly that you do not need to eat animal foods to be healthy. And so I asked, why are you doing this? And the people told me how most of the food that we're growing, we're feeding to animals. People are starving. These food shortages are the direct result of eating animal foods and creating a food shortage for other human beings, which was causing war. So they said, we're eating lower on the food chain, so there's enough for everyone to eat. And I thought, that's such a great idea. Why don't we all do that? Why don't we know about that? And they also explained to me, for the second reason, what these animals endure, the kind of mutilations and routine terror and fear and pain and despair that they're experiencing. And so that, in conjunction with the fact that I was eating every day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, meals of vegetables and grains and beans with these people, I learned, basically. I learned by example. So I've never eaten meat in my life since that day back in 1975, thanks to these people. So that's the thing to understand, is that all of us, the only reason any of us eats animal foods, there's only one reason that we eat meat, dairy products, and eggs. That one reason is we do it because we're following orders. And I was just following orders. I was just doing what I was told to do by my mother and father and teacher and friends and neighbors, the minister, all of the doctors, and everyone told me to do this. And so it passes down from generation to generation. If I hadn't gone to this community and learned another way, I would be doing the same thing and passing it on to my children. But luckily, I saw this community. I realized that there's another way of living. And that's really what Philip is doing with this channel. It's helping to create a community to understand more clearly the truth that we do not need to imprison and kill other beings. And when we do that, we cause terrible misery and despair and violence to them and to ourselves. It comes right back. I saw that, and it liberated me. And a few years later, I learned a little bit more and became a vegan when I understood more about dairy and egg production. A few years after that, I became a Zen Buddhist monk in Korea, and I realized I was living in a monastery in South Korea that had been practicing veganism for 750 years. So I realized that this idea of veganism is not a new hippie idea, actually. It's an ancient wisdom tradition that goes back thousands of years, in both in Eastern and Western society. People have understood that if we're really serious about spiritual awakening, if we're serious about creating a society of harmony, then there's no way we can be eating animal-based foods, because that completely destroys the foundation of peace and health and sustainability. And each one of us can actually be a force for healing. So for me, meditating for basically 12 hours a day from 3 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock at night for months on end in silence when I was in Korea helped me to go deeper and realize how my mind had been colonized and sort of taken over by the society that I had been born into, and I realized that another way of living is possible. So questioning the official narrative in our society is the key to liberation for ourselves, and then sharing these ideas with other people is critical also. So I am totally committed to the mission, together with myself and my wonderful wife, Madeline, to sharing these ideas of liberation, because the basic idea is when we liberate animals, we liberate ourselves. And liberating ourselves is really, I think, why we're on this earth. So I hope that all of us can learn from this. We can learn that each one of us as an individual, we have a conscience, we can reflect, we can contemplate, we have a rational mind, we can make these connections, we have a heart, we can feel into the suffering of these animals, we can feel into the suffering of hungry people, of indigenous people whose homes are destroyed by animal agriculture. We can feel into the people that we affect, the workers who have to stab animals all day, who have the highest rates of injury and spousal abuse and child abuse and drug addiction and alcoholism because they're just committing violence so we can eat animal-based foods. Animal agriculture is webs of violence. So to realize that each one of us as an individual, we can understand this, we can make an effort to be aware of this, and then we can act. We can bring our lives into harmony with this understanding and live our lives as an expression of kindness and caring. And when we do that, we become a radiating beacon of kindness and compassion because we're living this life and we're being part of the solution rather than just being part of the problem. So I want to thank all of you for listening, for caring, and for acting on this, and for doing the best you can to understand this, to share these ideas with other people, and together we can co-create a world where peace and freedom and justice and sustainability are actually possible, because they are possible. A door is beckoning, it is open, there's nothing stopping us from getting there except animal agriculture and the programming to put on the blinders and not care about animals, not care about other people. When we start caring, this is the sacred feminine wisdom within all of us, and that brings us the wisdom that we all have to create a world of peace and freedom for all living beings. We're all interconnected. Thank you for caring. Go forth, please, and as best you can, understand and then multiply this message in all your relations. Thank you very much.